Hello and welcome to Sing the Score, our last before Christmas, and goodness we have a gem for you this time. It's Herbert Howells' Long, Long Ago from 1951, one of his 4 carol anthems, but written some 30 years later than the other 3, which are rather better known. A Spotless Rose, Here is the Little Door, and Sing Lullaby. All 4 pieces are being performed by E. Fagiolini at 7 p.m. on Christmas Eve as part of our Live from London Christmas event. Let's hear the opening of Long, Long Ago. I have to start by wondering who's actually watching this episode of Sing the Score. Is it our usual fans of early choral music, or are they turning off in horror as they realise it's Howells? I really hope not, because there are such resonances, such connections with music from an earlier time into this 20th century. It was certainly the case in my own background, and I'm sure in yours, if you've sung in chamber choirs, church and cathedral choirs, that you very quickly get used to singing music of an early period right alongside music of the present day. You don't give it a second thought. And in the UK, of course, in certain places, there is this continuation of institutions that have been singing the service from the 15th century right up until now. Not always maybe with the same standard. In the early 17th century, one southern cathedral was castigated for allowing its gentlemen back row singers to take dogs into the services with them. What a thought. We don't know as much as we'd like to about what voices were like in the 16th century. Were their ranges the same? Were they slightly different types? But there are enough similarities looking back into 16th century music for us to know that we can still enjoy singing that repertoire today. And then to take the same pleasure in singing music from the 20th century. And Howells himself was quite intricately involved in music from that earlier time, as I learned when I talked to Paul Spicer, composer, conductor, a former composition student of Howells, and now his biographer.
One of Howells's earliest jobs, really, which came out of his the fact that he had Graves' disease and was recovering from radium treatment, was to get a post with Westminster Cathedral with Richard Terry, editing Tudor church music. And this all came out of a connection Howells had with Terry, which was set up by Charles Stamford, who was Howells's teacher. And Stamford used to call going to Westminster Cathedral polyphony for a penny, my boy, because that was the price of the bus fare going from the Royal College to Westminster Cathedral. And that's really where Howells developed his great interest in early music, and especially in Tudor church music. And of course, Terry was a pioneer in all that in this country, and Howells was absolutely swept away by this music. And a lot of that early music that he wrote was really inspired by everything that he witnessed and also discovered through Terry. And of course, the early results were pieces like the Mass in the Dorian Mode, and those other pieces like the Nunc Dimittis setting and the Salve Regina and so on.
And if you look at the beginning of Long, Long Ago, well, for a start, the melody is written in the Aeolian mode, but also it sounds quite like plain chant.
Yes, that's I think what I always sort of wonder whether this title "Long, Long Ago" almost inspired him to think of an old connection, and that feeling of plain song at the beginning I think is palpable. In the same way that I also think that the harmonies, the way that he writes the early part of the piece seems to come very much out of the clavichord collection, Howells's clavichord, that he had fairly recently written, it's quite unlike Howells in some ways in his choral work, in that he was writing almost if he was writing at the keyboard this early part of the piece. And while he lay sleeping in a quiet night, that little bit is full of false relations and lovely sort of Tudorisms there, which I think are very much from a keyboard idiom more than a choral one. And that's incredibly unusual for Howells. In fact, I think the whole piece is much less contrapuntal than Howells normally is in his choral mode, really.
But then as it goes into the second half of the piece, we get much more of what singers would know and feel as traditional Howells, that Howells harmonic thumbprint. I mean, there's the whole Howells effect, isn't there? Lots of singers watching this, we know what it feels like to sing Howells. There is something it does to us, the way that sort of jazz-inflected harmony. I mean, who are his influences here?
He had there is a particular scale which he used, and actually he wrote out for me when I was studying with him, which it's very straightforward modal style scale, where if you were in C major, it has a sharpened fourth and a flattened seventh, so it'd be da 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 da. And of course, the implication of that is a chord of C major and a chord of F sharp major. Which is about the most subversive pair of harmonies that you can get. That instantly, I mean, and of course, there is an exact example of that scale at the bottom of page 3, where you've got this long ago, so long ago.
And that's inflecting the tune that we've already heard at this stage. It feels just like a sort of natural growth of it, but it's actually fitting into that scale.
I think the one of the key things about Howells is that when he's writing either secular or sacred music, and perhaps particular sacred music, it is this treading a very, very thin line between spirituality and sensuality. Now, you might say this is a secular poem, but of course it is it has religious connotations throughout it. It's all about the birth of Jesus, and it is what we get from Howells in this is certain moments when he has a word which is, if you like, lights a touch paper, and the word in this piece, I think, is the word woe. There are two great moments, one in the last bar of page 5, where there's one of those fantastic Howells clusters, which is so powerful. And of course, for singers, it's a great moment, because there's that sense of coming together where you know that you want to give a lot, but actually you've got to sublimate your own personality to the greater good of the whole chord. And of course, one of the other great things, talking about the second half of the piece, one of the other great things about Howells is his approach to endings. And here, I think everybody would agree probably that Spotless Rose is his most classic example of one of the most extraordinary endings and chordal progressions. Patrick Hadley used to send him a Christmas card every year quoting that, saying, "Oh, Herbert, what a cadence," every single year. But this one, I think, comes pretty close, going from Christ was born in Bethlehem, when everything absolutely explodes into fireworks. The altos going up the first altos, they were going right up at the top of their range into an E on a triplet against everything else. Of course, that has that incredibly sensuous flow in it. The tenors rising up, the contrary motion in it with the sopranos coming down, the bass is sitting pinned underneath it on that low G sharp. And then I think the best thing about it is that it's not just coming to this Bethlehem, for which everybody does except the first basses and the tenors, who extend it by 2 further notes. So it's almost as if he says, "I can't leave this." It's just so gorgeous. I just wanted to go on. Then we get a moment of silence, and then, as you say, there's this wonderful resolution, which sometimes Howells goes to places for cadences, final cadences that we don't expect. This one ends with such solace on this beautifully textured E major chord. And I think this goes back to the connection with John Buxton and this the fact that he was in a prisoner of war camp when he wrote this piece. And of course, the poem is called Carol in Wartime. And the key verse for Buxton, obviously, I think in this is the very last verse where he says that the Christ was born in order that wars should cease. And interestingly, Howells had a correspondence with Buxton wanting to change the word wars to the word strife. And Buxton actually said, "Okay, if you want to do that, you can." But it's interesting that Howells, in the end, decided to leave it as wars. And I'm glad that he did, really, because I think it was so important to the connection with Buxton himself, who was so caught up in this prisoner of war camp.
Paul, some 20, 30 odd years ago, you and I were working a lot together in the Finzi Singers, your professional choir that I booked the singers for. And we sang mostly music of this period, British music of this period. And I was trying to think what I remembered most about those times. There was never quite enough rehearsal time, which I think is common to most British choral professional ensembles, but there was money, amazingly, to pay for CD making. I remember a lot of giggling, mostly led by Andrew Carwood, who's now, of course, organist and master of the choristers at St Paul's Cathedral. But I remember particularly doing 2 Howells recordings. And I mean, you've always encouraged in all your singing, whether amateurs or professionals, a real heart-on-sleeve approach because the music demands it. And I think we just gave ourselves totally to this first day of Howells recording. And the next day we were just kind of emotionally shell-shocked. Does that ring a bell?
Goodness, it does. I remember it so well. I think a lot of those Finzi Singers recordings were draining to a great degree. I mean, this British music of this period is partly what appeals to me so much. It's deeply emotional music. I think that the composers, not just Howells, but the other composers we did, they responded so well to text. And the power of the result was terrific. But that particular disc, I remember very, very well. Andrew Lumpson playing the organ, and the repertoire included some pretty hard-hitting stuff which really nobody knew. It's very rare. Now that was part of the point of the Finzi Singers, really, was to introduce a lot of the choral repertoire of this period, which nobody really knew at that time. I remember being very worried indeed at the end of that day that what we were going to hear first thing the next morning when we all met again. I mean, of course, you were all consummate professionals and got on and did the job, but I think probably you weren't able to sing for a couple of days after it.
Paul, lovely to talk to you.
Thank you.
Paul referred to the poem by John Buxton, who was an ornithologist, but also an English scholar. He worked in British intelligence at the start of World War II and published this poem in a volume called Such Liberty at the end of the war. but he was captured in May 1940 and wrote Carol in Wartime as a prisoner on his first Christmas Eve in captivity. I think that this is the front of the prisoner's Christmas card that year in Oflag 7. You can see it says Oflag 7 at the top, where he was held. But if anyone can clarify that, I'd be most grateful. So A Carol in Wartime was written exactly 80 years ago this Christmas Eve. And what a thing to reflect on, that Buxton's legacy and that of so many like him is now rewarded by our own government sending out gunboats against our own allies. We are so much better than this, non-British watchers, and normal service will be resumed at some point in the future. In Buxton's poem, the first 4 lines are in fact a refrain, which comes back after every verse, though Howells takes different phrases from it each time. And after that opening plain chant-like melody, the first verse is set to a sort of soprano recitative with a weaker sense of a strict pulse that allows the natural stress of the words to predominate. But it also highlights the deliberately frail rhythm on the word frailty, which is then stabilised by the regular 3 in a bar that follows, embodying in the music the infant's apparent frailty, but then his role as the world's stay. And choir directors especially, but all of us really, you see those lines of emphasis over world's stay. These imply more than just a lengthening. Instead, take them as an invitation to ask your singers really to think about those words. Because we all know how easy it is to forget about the text sometimes. I say sometimes, quite a lot of the time, if we're thinking about tuning ensemble, watching the conductor, all that sort of thing. And to conductors, I'd say, don't worry about the result you get back from this when they start. It might be quite messy as a result. But like children getting their hands dirty, it sometimes needs to be messy to start with. And then eventually you'll get something really strong on those words that carries a lot more meaning and doesn't feel so imposed. We've now moved from that opening melody, which was in the Aeolian mode, to a cadence of E major. The mode at the beginning now being symbolically transformed through Christ's birth. And the altos seem to almost play with that transformation at the beginning of verse 2 with what is really a Phrygian melody. Sorry about all these modal terms. The Phrygian is the pattern of tones and semitones you get by playing E to E on the piano's white notes. But then the cool thing, as Greg would say,
I would,
is that the altos sing their Phrygian melody over the top of a straight major chord underneath, one of Paul's Tudorisms. So you're getting the major and minor version of the chord at the same time. We just don't seem to be able to get away from this on Sing the Score. It was Purcell doing it in episode 22, until you see that 2 of the vocal parts had F sharps against those F naturals all along. Before that, Monteverdi. And many more, because these masters of composition for voices understood the sweetness of minor over major. Although Howells, in fact, may have thought that sort of colour really related more to jazz than to earlier music, because at the time that he was working for Tudor Church Music, I think he started in 1917, it was fairly customary to edit out such false relations because the editor's assuming that it was some sort of mistake. Then it's that moment that we hear the melody from the Howells scale, the opening Dorian, so long ago, being transformed into so long ago. And it really makes the texture shimmer at that moment, taking us back into the past. Before an A minor interlude, when those Howells fingerprints really begin to tell. I can hear the Howells lovers amongst you shouting out, "Ooh, ooh, Howells!"
Howells!
Yeah, Howells.
Because we've just heard. And there's more to come. On the words God's Son, he creates a sort of aural halo. It's like those stained glass images or paintings where the infant Jesus appears lit up. But it's not just harmony that achieves that halo. There's also diminuendo, and the music just seems to be suspended for a moment. And then the two chords for Mary's crooked arm, which to me feel like the two parts of a crooked arm, with their slightly ungainly fourths. But that may just be me. Let's hear those bits together. And at this moment the refrain comes back, but now it's really leading the drama. It's not any sense of just a quiet refrain. Great pair of chords there at the end too.
Thanks.
Ah, no, I mean on the word woe. As Paul Spicer mentioned, it's one of those touch paper words for Howells in this piece, and he really latches onto it in this carol anthem. It's basically just A major, with that nice Gershwin sixth, but plus the minor third as well. And then it resolves nicely to B major, with a few added notes. And it continues, shepherds at the sheepfolds. Is that meandering melisma there, the wandering of the sheep? Or just a melisma? And then we come to the three wise men, not currently leading the government in this country, but perhaps heard here in the measured tread of the three lower voices. Brazen parallel fifths there. Something you're certainly not allowed to do in Renaissance music.
I write to protest in the strongest possible terms about the unconscionable use of parallel fifths.
And then Howells just sits on that chord and lets the major and minor version of it just riff against each other for a couple of bars. Leading to another chord on woe that this time doesn't resolve. And now a very lyrical start to the final section, the text very clear, and the mode changed from that opening Aeolian mode to a really translucent sounding major. Final recitative. finish that classic Howells ending. Paul talked about it already. But just note how Howells primes us for it before it starts so that we're really, really receptive. We've just cadenced on E major, and the next chord is C sharp major. That's a harmonic shift down 3 steps. 1, 2, 3. Our old friend from the 16th century.
It's tertiary shift.
With this tertiary shift, you can see the bass, the root of the chord, moving down 3 steps, E to C sharp, while the major third of the chord, the G sharp, which is sitting in the top of the chord here, stays where it is, everything else moving around to accommodate it. It's a bit like working with tenors.
Well, I say that is really unfortunate. He was doing so well. He kept it together in really difficult conditions since coming to the crease. And then with victory in sight, having done all the hard work, he's just gone and thrown it all away with behaviour that really brings him no credit at all. It demeans the profession's very, very finest exponents who work in really pretty challenging conditions. And having been on the end of that sort of behaviour myself, I'm here to tell you that's hurtful, it smarts, and he won't be going to my Christmas list this year.
And that paves the way for the voice-by-voice ascent to the word Bethlehem, the pinnacle of the piece. But even as he reaches for the summit, he's starting to prepare for the end, one element changing at a time. It starts with the tertiary shift, which moved us to that C sharp major in the first bar. The voices then start to rise, but even as he presents us with this illuminated vision of Bethlehem, the chord like an image of the star above the stable, he's reversing the tertiary shift to the chord it just came from, sliding imperceptibly to its close personal friend, the relative minor. Before those words, to heal the world's woe, which until this moment have always been coloured with woeful harmony, are now appearing on a simple E major chord, because the world's woe has been healed through Christ's birth and no longer needs to be dissonant. Do take your time with this piece. Don't be afraid to come back to it. You shouldn't be able to sight read it just like that. Just sit and enjoy the care that this wonderful team of singers brings to this text. Perhaps we should have a session on tuning. Keep your tones close. That's very important in a piece like this. Mind you, you've got to keep something back for the World Lecture Tour of Sing the Score Live. There's a nice thought. Anyway, today please be sure to buy a ticket to our Christmas Eve concert if you haven't already. We're live at 7 p.m. on Christmas Eve, but it stays up for 3 weeks afterwards, so you can hear it whenever you want. There are also Howells' 3 other carol anthems, Here's the Little Door, Sing Lullaby and A Spotless Rose, as well as Charpentier's Messe de Minuit. For some reason that I clearly thought was a good idea when I was planning the concert, me in a dressing gown reading Dylan Thomas's A Child's Christmas in Wales.
But soon the voice grew louder. "Fire!" cried Mrs. Prothero, and she beat the dinner gong. And we ran down the garden with the snowballs in our arms towards the house. And smoke indeed was pouring out of the dining room, and the gong was bumbulating, and Mrs. Prothero was announcing ruin like a town crier in Pompeii. This was better than all the cats in Wales standing on the wall in a row.
And of course, thanks for contributing to the costs of making Sing the Score itself, which you can do at ifagilini.com/friends, and do also subscribe in the little button down the left there. We know this is niche, but we do it anyway in the hope that you get some sort of pleasure from it. in what has been a pretty strange year for everyone. So I'll say Happy Christmas with my Claire Wilkinson mug. You can get these from the new E. Fagellini store. Thanks for watching. Here comes the performance to sing along to. But first here's Greg with The Warning.
Dudes, seriously, be very wary of this piece. It's practically witchcraft, with its C-sharp major chords and Howellsian translucent harmonies and stuff that you choral geeks of a later period get really excited about. Of course, it doesn't have enough actual polyphony in it. And by the way, have you seen that we're doing these really cool polyphony hats? But despite that, I will grudgingly accept that it's a good piece. Mind you, if you want to hear great Howells, our Live from London concert has his A Spotless Rose in it, and the baritone soloist in that performance is really very, very fine.
Left them.